Right. So, in context to Amazon Web Services, as we all know, today I'm going to discuss about the flow details as well as the flow process in context to AWS when we are working on it. So we know like AWS is one of the cloud service provider, prominent cloud service provider, which normally provide cloud services in the field of infrastructure, platform, as well as software services, all that. In this regard, it is always important and it is something nowadays which is becoming mandatory and important, wherein to understand about the flow process and all everything is something essentially required. In this regard, there is something which normally to create different configuration flows is what something which we have to be learned with. So creating a flow is what something which we have to understand. In context to that, even data encryption and all everything is also something essentially required for us to manage in detailed note. In this regard, so whenever we are working on the flow process and all, there are different flow processes we have to follow. Something like first one, we need to specify the flow details, whatever the flow details do we have and all everything that we have to be specified with. So once the specification of the flow details were added, so wherein by connecting to the different destinations or mapping the resources or adding filters and validations, etc., all that. We need to configure the flow process. Whatever the flow process do we have should also be configured in this regard. Followed by this, we need to map the data feeds because there are different types of data from one flow to another flow, which load from one system to another system. How to map the data and all everything is also one of the key and prominent element has to be added. Next one about adding filters, because if there is any filters to be created so that it is easy for you to research or it is easy for us to search whatever the relevant information is required. So that make sure we need to create filters for that for sure. Next, last but not least, reviewing and as well as creating is also some of the key and important element which we have to be known with. Now, if you want to specify the flow details and all, here we have to give a flow name. For example, right? So for example, billing process. Okay? This is what generally the flow name, right? Mandatory. Okay. This is what something which I have written in context to the flow process, flow description law. Normally, this flow process can be an optional thing, right? This is what something which I have written. Now, if you want to do any kind of data encryption and all that, so here we have an option where we can encrypt the data. Whatever the data is encrypted by default and all everything, we can encrypt it. So when we are going to encrypt the data and all, here we have an option where we can customize the encryption settings and all. If we want to create any kind of customization of encryption settings and all that, so wherein we have to create an AWS KMS key as separate. So when it is required, so when there is any data encryption, which normally are we going to take, and whenever there is a customization of encryption of settings requirements and all, everything were updated. So this is where something which we need to be mentioned under the data encryption part. So once the data encryption part, if there is any kind of adding tags and all, right? So if you want to create any kind of tags followed by entering value, so that entering keys and as well as tags can also be done. So once it is done, the next we need to mention about the flow process, whatever the flow processes do we have, and how these flow processes were created and all, and how this can be move on to the next level. especially whenever we are working on Amazon S3, right? So because whenever we are creating any kind of flow processing context to the Amazon S3 and all everything is what something which we have to be known with. In this regard, it's always important for us to configure the kind of flow processes whichever is required here. And whatever the flow processes are we going to maintain and all everything is what something which normally we do in this regard. This is what generally the overall understanding about the flow process in context to AWS itself is concerned is all about.